Snow fell like quiet ash over the forgotten train station, soft enough to seem merciful and cold enough to remind the world it was winter, the kind that pressed loneliness into the bones and asked nothing in return. Caleb Rowe, 30 years old, reined his horse beneath the warped awning, his breath fogging the air as if even his lungs were uncertain they belonged anywhere anymore. He had come to town for supplies and silence, and instead he found a girl asleep on a bench, snow gathering in her dark hair as though the night itself had tried to claim her. She was small beneath the weight of the cold, wrapped in cloth worn thin by too many departures, and something in him paused as if memory had reached out and caught his sleeve. Who left a girl alone in winter, and what kind of fear taught her to sleep so still, he wondered as the snow kept falling. He did not wake her at first, because waking felt like trespassing on whatever fragile peace she had found. Caleb slipped off his coat, the wool heavy with his own warmth, and laid it over her shoulders with a care he usually reserved for injured animals or cracked china. When her eyes fluttered open, dark and startled, fear flashed first, sharp as a blade, before curiosity softened it just enough to breathe. She looked at him as if he were another danger come to finish what the cold had begun, and he lifted his hands slightly, palms open, a gesture older than language. "Come home with me if you want," he said, his voice low and steady, offering rather than asking, and the snow listened closely to see which way her life would turn. Her name was Ayanna Gray Willow, 20 years old, and she carried her story the way some people carry scars, quietly, with no expectation of being asked. On the ride to his cabin, the world narrowed to the sound of hooves crunching through snow and the steady warmth of Caleb's back before her, and in that narrowing her memories rose in fragments like breath in cold air. She had been an orphan long before she knew the word, taken in by necessity and put to work in Silas Crowder's house, where kindness had worn a mask and patience had learned the shape of waiting. Silas had spoken of marriage as if it were charity, his voice thick with certainty that her future belonged to him because he had decided it should, and the night she ran had been colder than this, fear pushing her feet forward while dignity pulled her heart behind. Caleb did not interrupt when she spoke, and the silence he gave her felt like shelter rather than absence, making her wonder why a man would help without asking for anything in return. His cabin waited at the edge of the trees, half buried in snow, smoke curling from the chimney like a promise that someone still believed in warmth. Inside, firelight breathed against pine walls, and frost traced delicate veins along the windowpanes as if the cold were trying to remember beauty. Caleb gave her space in ways that mattered, setting a separate bed, turning his back while she ate, letting quiet settle without demanding conversation. When they walked into town together days later, whispers followed them like drifting snow, and Sheriff Thomas Hale's warning came wrapped in politeness but carried the weight of threat. Yet it was in the smallest moments that something unspoken grew. Caleb repairing the torn sole of her moccasin, Ayanna pressing warm cloth to his frostbitten hands, both of them learning each other's rhythms without naming what they were becoming. One night, the sound of a horse outside broke the stillness, and fear crept back into the cabin on careful hooves. The town grew colder as winter deepened, and not just because of the snow. Men who had shared tables with Caleb now looked away, and women's voices lowered when Ayanna passed, as if her existence were a question best not asked aloud. Sheriff Hale spoke of peace and order, of how some things were better kept separate, and Ayanna heard her humanity reduced to inconvenience. She packed her few belongings one evening, believing that love meant leaving before she could be taken, but Caleb stopped her with a sentence spoken so softly it barely disturbed the air. "You don't owe this town your disappearance," he said, choosing her over belonging without ceremony. The snowstorm that night swallowed the world whole, and at dawn Caleb rode out for supplies, leaving her alone with both hope and dread in equal measure. Silas Crowder arrived while the cabin still held Caleb's warmth, his presence heavy and inevitable as a storm you recognize too late. He spoke of rights and promises, of papers and power, and when Ayanna resisted, he took her as if the world had taught him that want was permission. The cabin stood empty when Caleb returned, her shawl lying where it had fallen like a word cut short, and panic moved through him without sound or spectacle. He followed their trail into the white vastness, devotion driving him faster than thought, and when he found them, the violence that followed was brief and controlled, more rescue than revenge. He brought her back shaking and silent, and that night fear burned through her veins until she collapsed into fever, leaving him to wonder if saving someone was ever enough. Ayanna drifted between worlds as the fever took her, murmuring fragments of memory and fear, and Caleb stayed awake through it all, refusing sleep as if vigilance alone could keep her here. He cooled her skin, pressed his forehead gently to hers, and whispered reassurances he had never practiced saying aloud, words meant only for this moment. When he kissed her, it was soft and reverent, a comfort rather than a claim, and outside the snow fell without pause, bearing witness to a love neither of them had yet named. By dawn her breathing evened, and something in him settled into certainty, though the future remained unwritten. Recovery came slowly, measured in small victories and shared glances, and when they finally spoke honestly, it felt like stepping onto solid ground after a long crossing. Caleb offered marriage not as rescue but as partnership. His hands opened the way they had been at the station, and Ayanna accepted with tears that carried agency rather than gratitude. Sheriff Hale confronted them once more, torn between law and conscience, and the town divided itself along lines that had always existed but never been tested. As preparations began despite opposition, curiosity lingered in the air like breath before speech, asking whether love could survive being seen. The ceremony was small and reverent, held beneath a sky so pale it felt as though the world itself had gone quiet to listen. Snow drifted down in slow, deliberate spirals, settling on shoulders and lashes like a benediction rather than a burden, and for the first time all winter it did not feel cruel. It felt chosen. Ayanna stood beside Caleb, her hand in his, fingers trembling not from cold but from the enormity of being seen and staying anyway, and when she lifted her eyes to his, the years of running seemed to loosen their hold on her breath. The silence around them was deep, broken only by the hush of falling snow, and in that stillness their hearts spoke louder than any gathered witness ever could. Their vows were not grand or practiced, but they were honest in a way that made the air feel warmer. Caleb's voice wavered when he promised her a home that would never demand her disappearance, and Ayanna's tears fell freely as she vowed to stand with him even when the world turned its face away. Their hands shook as if the future itself were passing through them, and when they pressed their foreheads together, it felt less like a gesture and more like a prayer answered. Even Sheriff Hale, standing at the edge of the gathering, felt something in his chest shift as love made itself undeniable, no longer a thing that could be argued against or quietly undone. When it was over, when the last words had settled into the snow, Caleb kissed her with a tenderness that held both promise and memory, and the town watched as if witnessing something it had once refused to imagine. Together they stepped forward, husband and wife, their footprints marking a shared path where there had once been none, and the snowfall closed softly behind them like a door finally choosing to stay open, leaving the world changed in a way that could not be taken back. After they were married, happiness did not arrive with trumpet calls or sudden ease. It came the way snow does when the storm has passed, quiet, patient, and certain. Mornings began with shared meals steaming between them, their knees brushing beneath the table. Smiles exchanged before words found the courage to rise. Laughter warmed the corners of the cabin where loneliness once lingered, and when Caleb brushed snow from Ayanna's hair, he did it slowly, as though each touch were a vow he intended to keep for the rest of his life. In those moments she would close her eyes, trusting not just his hands but the future they were building together, and the world beyond the window felt very far away. In the evenings, she sang softly while he mended tack by lamplight, her voice weaving itself into the wood and stone until the cabin remembered it even after the song ended. Caleb would pause sometimes, just to listen, his chest tightening with a tenderness he had never learned to name, watching the woman who had once slept on a frozen bench now move freely through the rooms of his heart. When she caught him looking, she would smile, shy and knowing, and he would reach for her hand as if the simple act of holding it could keep time from stealing anything precious. The cabin ceased to be a refuge from the world, and became a place the world could not touch, and that transformation felt like grace. The town's whispers softened and then fell away, not because its people suddenly understood, but because love had proven itself steadier than their judgment. Caleb and Ayanna walked through winter side by side, unafraid of the cold, finding warmth in shared glances and unspoken promises, and peace settled over them like a second snowfall, gentle, enduring, and earned. As the snow continued to fall year after year, it seemed to slow time itself, giving them space to love fully, deeply, and without apology, as though the world had finally learned to breathe at the same pace as their hearts. Years later, winter still returned as faithfully as breath, and snow still fell upon the land, but it no longer felt like something to be survived. It felt familiar, almost tender, as if the cold itself had learned their names. Caleb's hair had silvered at the temples, and Ayanna's laughter carried a depth shaped by years of being cherished, yet when they stood together at the window watching the first snowfall of the season, their hands still found each other with the same quiet certainty. Love had not softened them into complacency, it had steadied them, teaching their hearts how to endure without hardening, and that truth lived in every shared glance, every unspoken understanding that passed between them. Their life together was made of small, luminous acts. The way Caleb still rose before dawn to light the fire so the cold would never touch her first, the way Ayanna rested her head against his shoulder as if it were the safest place the world had ever offered. They did not speak often of the past, but it lived gently in their care for one another, transformed from wound into wisdom. What they had built required no witnesses now, only time, and even time seemed to move more slowly around them, reluctant to disturb a love so patiently earned. If you listen closely, the old soul telling this story might lean toward you here, voice lowered not in secrecy but reverence, and remind you that love is never possession, it is shelter offered freely, a recognition that says I see you, and you may stay. It is the courage to choose kindness when cruelty would be easier, the grace to open your hands instead of closing them, and the faith to offer a coat to a stranger in the cold, trusting that sometimes the truest love begins exactly there, unfolding quietly in the snow where only the heart can hear it,